There are moments in every ninja's life that split time cleanly into a before and an after. For most shinobi, that moment comes on a battlefield, or in the instant a blade finds its mark. But for one blonde, whisker-marked genin from Konohagakure, that moment came on a half-built bridge in the middle of a country drowning in fog, and by the time it was over, the world would never quite look at him the same way again. If you've been following this series, you already know how we got here. Team 7, Naruto Uzumaki, Sasuke Uchiha, Sakura Haruno, and their perpetually late but deceptively dangerous sensei, Kakashi Hatake, had taken what was supposed to be a simple C-rank escort mission: guard a bridge builder named Tazuna, walk him home to Wave Country, collect the pay, go home. Simple. Except nothing involving Naruto Uzumaki ever stays simple for very long, does it? And if this is your first time watching one of these What If episodes, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because what you're about to see is going to change everything you thought you knew about this story. The mission had already spiraled far past the C-rank the moment the demon brothers ambushed them on the road. It spiraled further when they learned their client had lied about the danger involved, and it broke completely open the day Zabuza Momochi, the demon of the hidden mist, a man whose name alone was enough to silence a room of jonin, stepped out of a wall of mist and very nearly ended Kakashi Hatake's life before the fight had even properly begun. Kakashi survived that first encounter. Barely. Trapped inside a suffocating dome of water, one arm useless, drowning in his own sensei's genjutsu-shattering resolve, he needed his students to save him, and they had. Naruto and Sasuke, working together, however grudgingly, had bought their teacher the opening he needed to finish Zabuza off with a single, decisive strike. Except Zabuza hadn't died. A masked hunter nin had appeared at the last second, driven Saban needles into Zabuza's neck, and carried the corpse away before anyone could question it too closely. Kakashi knew. Of course he knew. A hunter nin disposes of a body on the spot. They don't carry it off like a trophy. But he'd said nothing, not wanting to alarm his genin more than necessary, and instead had spent the following days recovering from chakra exhaustion while drilling his students in tree-climbing exercises meant to sharpen their chakra control. Now 1 week later the fog was back. And so was Zabuza. And so was that masked hunter nin, standing at his side like a shadow given shape. The bridge stretched out beneath a sky the color of wet ash, half-finished girders jutting into the mist like the ribs of some great, dying beast. Tazuna stood frozen behind his workers' fallen tools. Sakura had her kunai raised, guarding the bridge builder with a fierceness that surprised even her. And in the center of it all, Kakashi Hatake had just lifted his Hitaiite, exposing the crimson, spinning eye beneath, his Sharingan, locking eyes with Zabuza across the mist-choked battlefield. It seems, Zabuza rasped, water dripping from the massive cleaver strapped to his back, we get to finish this properly today. What none of them knew yet, what not even Kakashi, with his copied thousand jutsu and his battle-hardened instincts, could have predicted, was that today wasn't going to end the way any of them expected. Today, something buried for over a decade inside Naruto Uzumaki was about to wake up. And once it did, there would be no putting it back to sleep. Let's rewind for just a second, because context matters here. Naruto Uzumaki, 12 years old, orphan, Jinchuriki of the Nine-Tailed Fox, and, as far as anyone in Konoha knew, a boy with absolutely zero bloodline talent to speak of. No Sharingan. No Byakugan. No clan techniques passed down through generations. Just raw chakra reserves so massive they made veteran Jonin nervous, a mountain of untapped stubbornness, and a habit of somehow, impossibly, clawing his way through situations that should have killed him a dozen times over. What Naruto didn't know, what almost nobody alive still knew, was that his mother's side of the family carried more secrets than the entirety of the Uzumaki clan's famous sealing techniques could account for. Kushina Uzumaki hadn't just been a Jinchuriki with fearsome chakra chains. Buried deep in her lineage, folded so far back into history that even Konoha's own archives barely acknowledged it, was a bloodline that had been considered extinct for over 60 years. A bloodline born from a small, isolated offshoot of the Uzumaki clan that had once lived along a storm-battered coastline, a clan that fused the razor-sharp precision of wind release with something far rarer, storm release, a Kekkei Genkai capable of charging wind itself with crackling, cutting electricity. That clan had been hunted to near extinction during the chaos of the old clan wars, their techniques feared as much as they were coveted. The line had all but died out, save for one surviving thread that had quietly married into Kushina's family generations back, deluded, dormant, waiting. It had never once activated in Kushina. It had skipped her entirely, buried under the weight of the Uzumaki's own chakra reserves and chain techniques. But dormant isn't the same as gone, and chakra like that doesn't just disappear. It waits. It waits for exactly the kind of moment currently unfolding on that fog-covered bridge, a moment of raw, desperate, life-or-death terror, the kind that cracks a person open down to the studs. Today, that moment had arrived. The battle began exactly as brutally as you'd expect from two S-rank level shinobi settling old scores. Kakashi and Zabuza clashed in the mist, blades and jutsu flashing, water clones rising and falling like waves given violent purpose. Sasuke, meanwhile, found himself locked in a duel of his own against the masked Hunter Nin, a duel that was going very badly, very quickly. Because here's the thing about that Hunter Nin. That mask wasn't hiding some grizzled veteran assassin. It was hiding a genin barely older than Sasuke himself, a boy named Haku, raised by Zabuza after tragedy stripped away everything else in his life, trained in a bloodline of his own, the ability to manipulate ice with terrifying, silent grace. Haku's speed was otherworldly. Sasuke, for all his prodigious talent, found himself outmatched, outpaced, and steadily surrounded by rising walls of mirrored ice, the signature technique of Haku's bloodline. A crystalline dome that turned the user into dozens of reflected, near-simultaneous attackers. Saban needles began raining from every angle. Sasuke, activating his own newly awakened Sharingan out of sheer desperation, managed to track some of the strikes, but not all of them. Not nearly all of them. Naruto arrived at a dead sprint, kunai in hand, screaming Sasuke's name into the mist. He was too late to stop what happened next. Haku, faced with an approaching second target and unwilling, despite Zabuza's orders, to kill children if he didn't have to, made a split-second decision that would ripple through everything that followed. Rather than lethal strikes, he unleashed a coordinated barrage meant to incapacitate. Dozens of Saban converged on Sasuke's pressure points from every mirror simultaneously. Sasuke went down hard, his body seizing up, collapsing into the frost-slick planks of the bridge, and Naruto, sprinting straight into that glittering dome of ice, straight into a technique he had no way of countering, no training to face, no plan beyond raw, blind loyalty, was about to become Haku's next target. This is the moment. Right here. Everything that follows in the series traces back to these next few seconds, so if you don't want to miss a single beat of what happens after this, make sure that notification bell is on, because this next part changes the entire trajectory of Naruto's story. Time seemed to slow down for Naruto in a way he never experienced before. He could see Sasuke, crumpled and unmoving, steam curling faintly off his skin in the cold air. He could see Haku's reflection multiplying across a dozen ice mirrors, each one raising a hand, each one drawing needles of ice and metal. He could hear Sakura screaming somewhere behind him, could hear Kakashi's voice cutting through the mist, desperate and too far away to help. And underneath all of it, Naruto felt something he could not name ignite in his chest. It wasn't the familiar, boiling heat of the Nine-Tails chakra. He'd felt that particular sensation before, that red, feral pressure clawing up from somewhere deep inside him. This was different. This was cold and hot at once, a static charge crawling up his spine like lightning deciding to take the scenic route through his nervous system. His vision sharpened at the edges. The hair on his arms stood on end. Somewhere in the mist above him, he swore he heard the low, rolling growl of thunder, despite the fact that there hadn't been a cloud in the sky an hour earlier. Not gonna, Naruto gritted out, skidding to a halt in front of Sasuke's fallen body, throwing his arms wide as though he could physically block an attack coming from every direction at once. Not gonna let you touch him, Haku's Senban launched. Dozens of them. From every mirror. Converging on a single point with the kind of merciless efficiency that had made Haku, despite his young age, one of the deadliest shinobi currently on that bridge. And then the air itself seemed to disagree with the laws of physics. A pulse of pressure erupted outward from Naruto's body, silent for half a heartbeat, and then anything but wind gathering with impossible speed, coiled around him in a spiraling vortex, and threaded through that wind, crackling and hissing, was something that looked unmistakably like captured lightning, not the smooth, controlled arcs of a proper lightning release technique. This was raw, jagged, undisciplined static, forking through the air the way cracks spread across ice. The sunbomb that reached that spinning wall of charged wind didn't just get deflected. They shattered, sparked, and were flung backward with enough force to crack two of Haku's ice mirrors clean through. For a long, suspended moment, nobody on that bridge moved. Haku, half visible through the shattered remnants of his technique, stared at the boy standing protectively over his fallen teammate. A boy wreathed in a churning halo of wind and static that arced faintly, blue-white against the gray mist, hair standing on end, whisker marks somehow darker, sharper, as though the chakra surging through him was drawing every part of him into focus. Across the bridge, locked in his own furious exchange with Zabuza, Kakashi Hatake froze mid-motion. He knew that feeling. Not the specific chakra signature, he'd never felt anything quite like it before, but the shape of the moment, the particular, gut-deep wrongness of witnessing something that should not exist. Because Kakashi Hatake, copy ninja of Konoha, had spent years studying bloodlines. He'd copied Sharingan techniques, catalogued Kekkei Genkai from a dozen different clans across the elemental nations, memorized the theoretical signatures of dozens more that had gone extinct before he was even born. And somewhere in that vast, meticulously organized memory, a single fact surfaced with the force of a physical blow. Storm release. A wind-based Kekkei Genkai charged with electrical properties. A bloodline he had read about exactly once, in a single footnote in a restricted archive, attributed to a clan that had been wiped out, or so everyone believed, decades before Kakashi was even born. A bloodline that, as far as any official record was concerned, no longer existed anywhere in the elemental nations, and it was currently crackling around his students' fists like a second skin. What? Kakashi breathed, and for possibly the first time in the entire mission, the unflappable Jonin sounded genuinely, thoroughly rattled. Naruto had no idea what had just happened. Not really. He stood there, chest heaving, static still crawling faintly across his knuckles, staring at his own trembling hands like they belonged to somebody else. The wind around him settled slowly, the crackling hum fading back into ordinary silence, leaving behind only the ringing in his ears and the smell of ozone hanging thick in the cold, misty air. What was that? He muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. Behind him, Sasuke groaned, stirring weakly, his Sharingan flickering as consciousness fought its way back through the paralytic numbness spreading from the Senbon wounds. He hadn't seen what happened, not clearly, but he'd felt it. Felt the air pressures shift violently around him even through the fog of unconsciousness. Haku, for his part, had retreated a full body length back, one hand pressed flat against the cracked ice mirror, expression unreadable behind his mask but his posture betraying something close to genuine caution, an emotion this particular shinobi rarely allowed himself in combat. That chakra, Haku said quietly, voice carrying an edge Naruto hadn't heard from him before. That's not a technique. That's a bloodline. A pause. One I didn't think anyone still carried. A bloodline? Naruto blinked, glancing down at his own crackling fingertips as the last traces of static faded away. What are you talking about? I don't have a bloodline. I'm just Naruto. Kakashi's voice cut across the bridge, sharp with an urgency that stopped Naruto cold. His sensei was moving toward him now, abandoning his exchange with Zabuza for just long enough to close the distance, single visible eye scanning Naruto up and down as though checking for injuries. Or perhaps checking that the boy standing in front of him was still, in fact, the same student he'd left standing there a minute ago. Kakashi-sensei, I don't know what that was. Naruto's voice cracked, half panic, half something that sounded suspiciously like excitement fighting to break through the fear. It just happened. Sasuke was hit, and I got so angry, and then the wind just... I know, Kakashi said, and the grim weight behind those two words silenced Naruto instantly. I know what it looked like. Across the bridge, Zabuza had gone very still as well, his massive cleaver lowered slightly, his single visible expression unreadable beneath the bandages wrapping the lower half of his face. Even a man like Zabuza Momochi, someone who had built an entire violent career out of not being surprised by anything, found himself staring at the blonde genin with something bordering on wary reassessment. Storm release, Zabuza said slowly, testing the words like he didn't quite believe them even as he said them. I heard rumors. A clan wiped out generations ago. Didn't think there'd be one of them running around in the Leaf Village of all places. If you're new to this series and you're wondering just how big a deal this is, picture the rarest Kekii Genkai you can think of. The kind of bloodline entire villages have gone to war over. Now imagine that bloodline surfacing, completely unannounced, inside the one shinobi in the entire story that literally nobody, not the third Hokage, not Kakashi, not even Naruto himself, ever expected to carry one. That's the situation unfolding on this bridge right now. And we are just getting started. Kakashi didn't have time to process the full implications, not with Zabuza still standing across from him and the situation on the bridge nowhere near resolved. But even in the middle of an active engagement, some part of his mind was already racing ahead, cataloging, calculating. Storm release. Wind and lightning fused into a single, cutting current. If what he just witnessed was accurate, and Kakashi trusted his own observations implicitly, then Naruto had just displayed, completely on instinct, a defensive technique capable of shredding a barrage of Saman and cracking solid ice with raw, uncontrolled output. Not a trained jutsu. Not a rehearsed form. Pure, panicked, instinctive bloodline activation, which meant one very important thing, that had been Naruto holding back nothing, and it had still very nearly gotten away from him entirely. Naruto, Kakashi said, low and urgent, crouching briefly beside Sasuke to check the extent of the Saman damage. Chakra points, not lethal wounds, thankfully. Haku's restraint had likely saved Sasuke's life more than any defensive technique could have. Listen to me very carefully. Whatever that was, you don't understand it yet. You don't have control over it yet. Don't try to force it again unless you have absolutely no other choice. Understood? But it worked. Naruto protested, some of the shock finally giving way to his usual stubborn fire. It saved Sasuke. If it happens again, maybe I can. That's exactly what worries me, Kakashi cut in, sharp enough that Naruto actually flinched. A technique you can't control isn't a weapon, Naruto. It's a liability. You could have hurt Sasuke just as easily as you protected him. You could hurt yourself. His single eye flicked briefly towards Zabuza, gauging the immediate threat, before returning to his student. We will figure out what happened here later. Right now, I need you to focus on getting Sasuke to safety and staying out of this fight until I say otherwise. It wasn't the answer Naruto wanted. It never was, with Kakashi. But something in his sensei's tone, an edge of genuine alarm Naruto had rarely heard from the normally unbothered Jonin, was enough to make him swallow his protest and nod instead. Haku, watching this exchange from behind his cracked ice mirrors, seemed to come to a decision of his own. Whatever calculations were running behind that mask, the appearance of an unknown, potentially catastrophic bloodline had clearly shifted his priorities. Zabuza-sama, Haku called out, voice carefully neutral. I believe it may be wisest to disengage. This situation has become more complicated than anticipated. Zabuza's eye narrowed, glancing between his young charge and the blonde genin still standing protectively over his fallen teammate, static residue faintly crackling at the edges of his vision if he looked closely enough. Whatever Zabuza's own history and instincts told him about that bloodline, and clearly it told him something, given how quickly his aggressive stance had cooled into calculation, he seemed inclined, for now, to agree. Copy ninja, Zabuza said, addressing Kakashi directly, cleaver settling back against his shoulder. Looks like today isn't the day after all. But this isn't finished. Next time we meet, it'll be settled properly. His gaze flicked, just briefly, toward Naruto. You might want to figure out what that kid's carrying before then. Things like that tend to attract attention, the wrong kind. And with that mist rolling in thick around him and Haku both, Zabuza Momochi retreated, vanishing back into the fog the same way he first appeared from it, leaving the bridge eerily silent in his wake. Nobody spoke for a long moment after they'd gone. Sakura reached them first, dropping to her knees beside Sasuke, checking his pulse with shaking hands even as Kakashi confirmed, more calmly, that the Senbon wounds were paralytic rather than lethal. Tazuna hovered nearby, pale and visibly shaken, clutching his tools like a lifeline, and Naruto stood there in the settling fog, staring down at his own hands as though they might start crackling again at any moment. "Kakashi-sensei," he said quietly, all the earlier bravado drained out of his voice, replaced by something smaller, more uncertain. What was that? Really? You know something? I can tell." Kakashi straightened slowly, looking down at his student with an expression that, for once, held none of his usual lazy detachment. This was the face of a man who had just watched his understanding of the world shift meaningfully on its axis, and hadn't yet decided how he felt about it. "I don't know everything," Kakashi admitted, which was, in itself, a rare enough occurrence to make Sakura glance up sharply from where she knelt beside Sasuke. "But I know enough to tell you that what just happened wasn't normal. That wasn't just chakra output, Naruto. That was a bloodline technique. A specific one. Extremely rare." He paused, weighing his next words carefully. "One that, as far as I was ever taught, doesn't exist anymore. Hasn't for decades." "A bloodline?" Naruto repeated, and for a moment, 12 years of being told, implicitly, explicitly, constantly, that he had nothing special about his lineage beyond an unfortunate destiny ward visibly across his face with the impossible idea that maybe, somehow, that had never been entirely true. "But I don't have a clan. I don't have parents. I don't," he stopped himself. Because that wasn't quite true either, was it? He had a mother. Had one, anyway, even if he'd never known her name until recently, even if the third Hokage had only ever offered him careful, guarded fragments about his heritage. Kakashi seemed to be following exactly the same train of thought, because his single visible eye had gone distant, calculating, turning over some private theory he clearly wasn't ready to voice aloud just yet. "We'll talk about this properly once we're back in the Leaf Village," Kakashi said finally, and there was something almost gentle in how he said it, an acknowledgement of just how much this had clearly shaken his normally unshakable student. "This isn't something to figure out standing in the middle of a mission. Right now, we need to get Sasuke back to Tazuna's house and make sure Wave Country is actually secure. Whatever this bloodline is, it isn't going anywhere. It's been waiting this long. It can wait a little longer for proper answers." It was, Naruto had to admit, sound advice. But sound advice had never once stopped him from asking questions anyway. "Just tell me one thing," Naruto pressed, jogging slightly to keep pace as Kakashi lifted Sasuke's unconscious form onto his back and began making his way toward Tazuna's house, Sakura hurrying alongside them both. Is it bad? Whatever this is? Should I be scared of it?" Kakashi considered the question for a long moment before answering, mist curling around them as the bridge slowly faded behind them into the gray distance. "I don't know yet," he admitted honestly. "But I know that clans powerful enough to be remembered, even as rumors, even decades after supposedly dying out, don't disappear from history by accident, Naruto. Something happened to whoever carried that bloodline before you. And whatever it was significant enough that almost nobody talks about it anymore." His visible eye flicked sideways, meeting Naruto's gaze directly. "That's not something I say to scare you. It's something I say because you deserve to know that what just woke up inside you might come with a history a lot bigger, and a lot more dangerous, than either of us currently understands." That night, in the modest, lantern-lit quiet of Tazuna's house, while Sasuke recovered under Sakura's watchful eye and Tazuna's family fussed over hot cups of tea for the exhausted shinobi crowded into their small home, Kakashi sat alone by the window, staring out at the dark shape of the unfinished bridge silhouetted against the night sky. He turned the memory over again in his mind, the crackling wind, the arcing static, the raw, untrained power that had shattered ice and deflected a lethal barrage without any technique behind it beyond pure, desperate instinct. Somewhere in Konoha's restricted archives, buried under decades of dust and deliberate obscurity, there was a name attached to that bloodline, a clan history that had been quietly filed away and largely forgotten, the way inconvenient, uncomfortable truths often were. Kakashi didn't know the details. Not yet. But he knew someone who might, and he had an uneasy, prickling certainty, the kind of instinct that had kept him alive through more S-rank missions than he cared to count, that whatever answers were waiting back in Konoha weren't going to be simple ones. Because bloodlines that powerful didn't just vanish from the world on their own. Someone had made sure of it. And now, 12 years later, hidden inside an orphan genin nobody had ever suspected of carrying anything beyond an unwanted burden sealed away in his gut, that bloodline had just announced, in the loudest possible way, that it hadn't disappeared after all. It had only ever been sleeping. The walk back from Wave Country had been quieter than the walk there. Sasuke had recovered fully from the paralytic Saban within a day, his pride wounded far more severely than his body, though he'd said remarkably little about the fight itself, and even less about the strange display of wind and lightning that had apparently saved his life while he lay unconscious on the bridge. Sakura, ever perceptive despite her tendency to hide it behind more obvious concerns, had noticed the way Kakashi kept glancing sideways at Naruto during the journey home, the way his usual lazy, half-present demeanor had sharpened into something closer to quiet, careful observation. Naruto himself had spent most of the walk unusually subdued, which, for a boy whose default volume setting was somewhere between loud and louder, was itself cause for concern. He kept flexing his fingers absent-mindedly, as though checking whether the static crackle from that day on the bridge might spontaneously return, half expecting sparks and half hoping for them. It didn't return. Not on the walk home. Not during the quiet nights at the various inns and camping spots along the way. Whatever had surged through him in that single desperate moment seemed to have retreated as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving behind only the memory of it, and 1,000 unanswered questions. By the time the four of them passed beneath Konoha's towering gates, Kakashi had made his decision. "Naruto," he said, catching the boy's sleeve gently as Sasuke and Sakura peeled off toward their respective homes, eager for actual beds after over a week away. "You're coming with me. We need to speak with the Hokage. Now, not tomorrow." "Now?" Naruto blinked, glancing down at himself, travel-worn, dusty, still wearing the same orange jacket he'd fought Zabuza and Haku in. "Can I at least get some ramen first? I haven't had a decent bowl in Naruto." Kakashi's tone, quiet as it was, carried an unusual firmness that made the protest die in Naruto's throat. "This is important. More important than ramen." Given that this was possibly the first time in recorded history that Kakashi Hatake had ever uttered the words more important than ramen in reference to anything involving Naruto Uzumaki, the boy fell into step beside his sensei without further complaint, curiosity finally outweighing his stomach's protests. The Hokage's office, as always, smelled faintly of old paper, pipe leaves, and the particular mustiness that seemed to cling to any room containing that much accumulated bureaucratic history. Hiruzen Sarutobi sat behind his broad desk, a modest cup of green tea steaming gently at his elbow, paperwork stacked in the kind of towering, precarious piles that suggested the third Hokage's ongoing war against administrative duties was, as usual, not going particularly well. He looked up as Kakashi entered, Naruto trailing a step behind, and something in his old, weathered face shifted the moment he registered the unusually serious expression on his Jonin's face. "Kakashi," Hiruzen said, setting down his pen with the deliberate care of a man who suspected he was about to need his full attention. "I take it the mission report requires additional context beyond the written summary." "Considerably more, Hokage-sama," Kakashi said, and then, without preamble, he laid it all out: the confrontation with Zabuza, the surprise appearance of Haku's ice mirror technique, Sasuke's incapacitation, and then, in careful, precise detail, exactly what had happened when Naruto had thrown himself between his fallen teammate and a lethal barrage of Saban. The wind. The crackling static arcing through the air like captured lightning. The way it had shattered ice and deflected metal with a violence that had no business coming from an untrained 12-year-old genin acting on pure panicked instinct. Hiruzen Sarutobi, a man who had lived through 3 shinobi world wars, who had personally witnessed some of the most devastating techniques the elemental nations had ever produced, went very, very still. "Describe it again," he said quietly. "The exact nature of the chakra." Slowly this time, Kakashi did, watching his Hokage's face carefully as he spoke, cataloging the flicker of recognition, followed swiftly by something that looked disturbingly like dread, that crossed the old man's features. When Kakashi finished, silence stretched through the office for a long, uncomfortable moment. "Hokage-sama," Kakashi said finally, when it became clear Hiruzen wasn't going to volunteer anything further on his own. You know what this is. I can see it on your face. I've spent the last several days trying to place that chakra signature in anything I've ever studied, and I came up with exactly one match, a footnote in a restricted archive text, describing a bloodline believed extinct for decades. Storm release. He paused. I need to know if I'm wrong. Hiruzen closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, he looked, for just a moment, every single one of his considerable years. You are not wrong, he admitted quietly. Naruto, who had been standing silently through this entire exchange, practically vibrating with the effort of holding his questions in, finally couldn't contain himself any longer. Okay, but what is it? He burst out. Everyone keeps saying bloodline like that's supposed to explain everything, but I don't have a clan. I don't have a family. I'm just Naruto. Hiruzen's voice, though gentle, carried enough weight to stop the boy mid-sentence. Sit down. Please. This is a conversation that deserves more than being shouted through in fragments. There was something in the old Hokage's tone, something heavier than Naruto had ever heard from him before, heavier even than the weight Hiruzen usually carried when discussing the nine tails sealed inside him, that made Naruto's protests die in his throat. He sat, slowly, in the chair across from the Hokage's desk, and waited. What I am about to tell you, Hiruzen began, folding his hands atop his desk, is information that exists in exactly 3 places within this village. My own memory. A single sealed archive document that requires my personal authorization to access. And, as of a few days ago on that bridge in Wave Country inside you. He paused, letting that settle. I had hoped, honestly, that this particular history would never need to be spoken aloud again. But given what happened, I no longer believe that hope is realistic. Kakashi, standing quietly beside Naruto's chair, said nothing, but his single visible eye had narrowed with focused attention. Long before the founding of the hidden villages, Hiruzen continued, during the era we now simply call the Warring Clan period, there existed a small clan along the storm-battered coastline far to the north, isolated, insular, fiercely protective of their own. They were not large. They were not, by most historical accounts, even particularly aggressive as clans of that era went. But they carried a Kekkai Genkai unlike anything else recorded in that period. A bloodline that fused wind release with something exceptionally rare even by Kekkai Genkai standards, storm release. The ability to charge wind itself with cutting, crackling electrical current. Naruto's breath caught slightly. That matched exactly what he'd felt surge through him on that bridge. Their techniques were formidable, Hiruzen went on. Capable, in skilled hands, of leveling terrain, redirecting lightning strikes, cutting through steel and stone alike with wind sharpened by electrical discharge. Understandably, this made them targets. Other clans of the era, fearful of what such power might mean in the hands of a rival, or hoping to seize the bloodline for themselves through conquest or forced marriage, began a slow, methodical campaign against them. His expression darkened. What followed was not a war. Wars, by their nature, have some semblance of structure, of declared intent. What happened to that clan was closer to an extermination. Coordinated raids from multiple directions, meant not simply to defeat them, but to erase them entirely from history. Their villages were burned. Their techniques, wherever discovered in writing, were destroyed rather than studied, out of fear that even the knowledge of the bloodline's existence might inspire someone else to hunt down whatever survivors remained. That's... Naruto's voice came out smaller than he intended. That's horrible. It was, Hiruzen agreed simply. And it very nearly succeeded completely. By the time the dust settled, the clan that once thrived along that storm coast had been reduced to scattered survivors, stripped of their lands, their history deliberately buried by the very forces that had destroyed them, in part out of fear of retaliation, and in part, I suspect, out of shame. There are few things more thoroughly erased from written history than the crimes committed by the eventual victors. He took a slow sip of his tea, as though needing the small ritual to steady himself before continuing. Most bloodlines that suffer that kind of near-total extermination simply vanish. The genetic thread phrase marries outward, dilutes across generations until the traits it once carried no longer manifest at all. That is, in fact, precisely what everyone, myself included, for a very long time, believed had happened here. But it didn't, Kakashi said quietly, understanding dawning. It did not, Hiruzen confirmed. One line survived, hidden and diluted so thoroughly across generations that the bloodline itself lay dormant, unexpressed, waiting. That line eventually intermarried, several generations back, into a very different clan entirely, one known far better throughout the elemental nations for an entirely separate set of abilities. A clan famed for its unique chakra reserves, its unparalleled skill in Fuinjutsu, and its chakra chains capable of binding even-tailed beasts. Naruto's stomach dropped as the pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The Uzumaki clan, he breathed. Yes, Hiruzen said gently. Your mother's clan, Naruto. Kushina's clan. For a long moment, Naruto simply sat there, absorbing the weight of what he'd just been told, turning it over and over like a coin he wasn't quite sure was real. So my mom, he started, voice unsteady. Did she have this? The storm thing? No, Hiruzen said, and something in the way he said it suggested he'd expected this exact question. As far as any record indicates, and I have reviewed what limited records exist on this matter with considerable care over the years, the bloodline never expressed itself in Kushina. It remained fully dormant throughout her life, buried under the more dominant expression of the Uzumaki clan's own natural chakra traits. She likely never even knew she carried it. Then why me? Naruto pressed, leaning forward, hands gripping the edges of his chair. Why now? Why did it just show up out of nowhere on that bridge? It was Kakashi who answered this time, his tone thoughtful, clearly working through the logic even as he spoke it aloud. Dormant bloodlines don't activate randomly. There's almost always a trigger, usually extreme emotional or physiological stress, life-threatening danger, particularly danger involving someone the carrier feels deeply protective toward, is one of the most commonly documented triggers across recorded Kekkei Genkai activations. His visible eye flicked toward Naruto. You threw yourself in front of a lethal attack to protect Sasuke. That kind of moment, that specific combination of fear, desperation, and protective instinct, is exactly the sort of catalyst that can force a dormant bloodline to the surface, particularly in someone carrying an unusually large and volatile chakra reserve to begin with. Hiruzen nodded slowly. Your reserves, Naruto, are considerably larger than anything a typical genin, or even most jonin, would possess, a fact we have always attributed primarily to the Ninetales chakra intermingling with your own. It is entirely possible that this same abundance of raw chakra provided exactly the kind of pressure needed to finally crack open a bloodline that had lain dormant for generations, once the correct emotional trigger presented itself. Naruto stared down at his own hands, turning them over slowly, as though searching for some visible trace of crackling static still lingering beneath the skin. So it's really mine, he said quietly. Not the fox's chakra. Not something I copied or got given by accident. Mine. From my mom's side. A real bloodline. Yes, Hiruzen said, and there was something almost sad in the gentleness of his voice as he said it. Genuinely, entirely yours, Naruto. Passed down, against every possible odd, from a clan that history itself tried very hard to erase completely. He paused. Which is precisely why I need you to understand something important before we go any further in this conversation. Naruto looked up, catching the sudden gravity that had settled back over the old Hokage's expression. This bloodline was hunted to near extinction once already, Hiruzen said carefully. Not because it was inherently evil, or dangerous in some uncontrollable way, dormant bloodlines rarely are, but because it was powerful, and rare, and other people feared what that power might mean in the wrong hands, or coveted what it might mean in their own. That fear has not gone anywhere in the intervening decades. If word spreads, inside this village or beyond it, that a bloodline believed extinct for generations has resurfaced, inside a Jinchuriki no less, there will be those who see that as an opportunity, and there will be those who see it as a threat requiring correction. The weight of that statement settled heavily over the room. Are you saying, Naruto said slowly, that people might come after me? Because of this? I am saying, Hiruzen said, that we must be exceptionally careful about how, when, and to whom this information is shared, until you have had time to develop enough control over the bloodline that it no longer poses an immediate risk to yourself or others, and until we have had time to properly assess exactly what kind of attention its resurfacing might draw. He glanced toward Kakashi. Which brings me to a decision I believe needs to be made immediately. If this conversation feels heavier than the usual Naruto content you're used to seeing, that's intentional. Because this is exactly the moment where this story stops being a simple what-if premise and starts becoming something with real weight behind it. A bloodline this powerful doesn't just hand Naruto a cool new jutsu. It hands him a target on his back that used to belong to an entire clan that got wiped off the map for having it. And that's a burden this 12-year-old is about to have to learn to carry, whether he's ready for it or not. If you're invested in seeing how he handles that weight, make sure you've subscribed, because this story is only getting heavier from here. Kakashi, Hiruzen said, I want you to begin working with Naruto on foundational wind release training immediately. Not the storm techniques themselves. Not yet, we do not yet understand them well enough to train them safely. But the underlying wind manipulation that the bloodline appears to build upon. Chakra-shaped transformation, wind-natured exercises, the fundamentals that any wind affinity shinobi would need regardless of bloodline. This will serve two purposes. It will begin building the control Naruto desperately needs, and it will provide a plausible, mundane explanation should anyone inquire about increased training sessions between the two of you. Kakashi nodded slowly. And the storm element itself? For that, Hiruzen said, I will need to consult certain restricted records, and possibly reach out to individuals with more direct historical knowledge than what exists in Konoha's own archives. This will take time. In the interim, Naruto, he turned back to the boy, expression softening slightly. I need you to promise me something important. What? Naruto asked warily. Do not attempt to deliberately trigger this bloodline again, Hiruzen said. Not until we have a far better understanding of what it actually does, and how much strain it places on your body when activated. What you displayed on that bridge was raw, uncontrolled, and by Kakashi's account, visibly costly to maintain even for the brief duration it was active. A bloodline capable of that much destructive output, wielded without proper control or understanding, is as much a danger to its user as to anyone it's aimed at. Naruto swallowed, nodding slowly, though the reluctance was plain on his face. Because of course it was. This was Naruto Uzumaki, a boy whose entire personality was built on the foundation of leaping before looking, of pushing forward through sheer stubborn will when caution would have suggested otherwise. Being told to hold back, to wait, to be careful, it went against nearly every instinct he possessed. But something in the weight of Hiruzen's words, and the genuine concern etched into the old man's face, was enough to make him nod anyway. Okay, he said quietly. I promise. I won't try to force it. But, and here, a flicker of the old, familiar fire returned to his eyes, when it's ready, when I actually understand how to use it properly, I'm gonna master it. This is mine. Nobody's taking it away from me, and nobody's gonna be scared of me because of it. I'm gonna prove that this bloodline isn't something to be afraid of. Hiruzen regarded him for a long moment, something that might have been pride, or perhaps something closer to bittersweet recognition of Kushina's own stubborn fire, reflected right back at him through her sun, softening the deep lines of his weathered face. I have no doubt that you will, Naruto, he said quietly. I have no doubt at all. The meeting concluded not long after, with Kakashi assigned to begin foundational wind-natured training with Naruto starting the following week, and Hiruzen promising to reach out through discreet channels to learn what more could be uncovered about the bloodline's history and its proper, controlled applications. As Naruto made his way out of the Hokage's office, mind still spinning with everything he just learned, Kakashi lingered behind for a moment, catching Hiruzen's eye with a silent question. You didn't tell him everything, Kakashi said quietly, once the door had closed behind Naruto's retreating footsteps. Hiruzen's expression, freed from the need to project calm reassurance for his young charge, settled into something far more troubled. No, he admitted. I did not. The archive document, Kakashi pressed. The one you mentioned exists under sealed restriction. That's not simply a historical account of the clan's destruction, is it? Hiruzen was quiet for a long moment, staring down into the cooling remains of his tea as though searching for the right word somewhere in its pale green depths. When Kushina Uzumaki came to this village, he said finally, she brought with her a number of scrolls and family records from her clan's own archives, remnants salvaged from Uzushiobikyo before its destruction. Most of these were catalogued, reviewed, and stored in our general clan archives without incident. He paused. One scroll, however, was sealed under a restricted access designation at Kushina's own explicit request, shortly before Naruto's birth. She never explained why. I never pressed the matter. Grief, at the time, seemed a more pressing concern than bureaucratic curiosity, and I assumed it contained personal family matters she wished kept private. You think it's related to this, Kakashi said slowly? To the storm release bloodline. I do not know, Hiruzen admitted. But given the timing of her request, so shortly before Naruto's birth, and given what we now know about the dormant nature of this bloodline within her own lineage, I find it difficult to believe the two are entirely unconnected. He set down his teacup with careful precision. I intend to review that scroll personally, under full restricted authorization, before I decide what, if anything, should eventually be shared with Naruto regarding its contents. Kakashi's single visible eye narrowed slightly. And if it contains something he needs to know, then he will know it, Hiruzen said simply. In time. Once we better understand exactly what we are dealing with, and once he has developed enough foundation, and enough safety, to receive that knowledge without it doing him more harm than good. He met Kakashi's gaze steadily. I trust you understand the necessity of that caution, Kakashi. We are dealing with a boy who has already carried more weight than most shinobi twice his age. I will not add to that burden carelessly. Kakashi held his Hokage's gaze for a long moment before finally nodding, some of the tension easing from his shoulders, though the questions clearly hadn't fully left his mind. Understood, Hokage-sama? That evening, alone in his office long after Kakashi had departed and the village outside had settled into its familiar nighttime quiet, Hiruzen Sarutobi made his way down into the deepest level of Konoha's restricted archive vault, a place accessible only through his own personal authorization, sealed behind layers of protective fuinjutsu that had taken the finest sealing masters of a previous generation months to properly construct. The scroll, when he finally located it among the carefully catalogued shelves, was smaller than he remembered, a modest, unassuming length of parchment, its edges slightly worn with age, sealed with a specific tag bearing Kushina Uzumaki's own handwriting. He held it for a long moment before finally, carefully, beginning the process of releasing its seal. What Hiruzen Sarutobi read in the flickering lamplight of that restricted vault, over the following hour, would leave the aging Hokage sitting in stunned, troubled silence long after he'd finished, his tea grown cold and forgotten on the small table beside him, his weathered face carrying an expression that mixed grief, alarm, and something that looked disturbingly close to fear, because whatever Kushina Uzumaki had chosen to seal away under restricted access, on the eve of her son's birth, was not simply a historical account of a destroyed clan. It was a warning. The training ground assigned for Naruto and Kakashi's sessions sat on the northeastern edge of Konoha, a relatively isolated stretch of cleared forest bordered by a shallow river and a scattering of weathered practice posts, chosen specifically, as Kakashi had explained on their very first morning there, for its distance from residential areas and its natural buffer against prying eyes. We're not just training wind manipulation here, Kakashi had said, standing with his hands in his pockets, watching Naruto stretch with visibly restless energy. We're doing it somewhere that limits collateral damage if things go sideways. And given what I witnessed on that bridge, I think it's fair to assume things might go sideways fairly often, at least at first. Things aren't gonna go sideways, Naruto had protested, cracking his knuckles with far more confidence than the situation probably warranted. I've got this. He did not, in fact, have this. The first week of training focused entirely on foundational chakra nature manipulation, the kind of exercises every wind affinity shinobi learned regardless of bloodline, Kekkei Genkai or otherwise. Kakashi produced a stack of specially treated paper, explaining with the patient, slightly bored cadence of a man who had given this particular lecture more times than he could count that chakra nature exercises always began with identifying and then refining one's natural affinity. Wind-natured chakra, Kakashi explained, holding up a slip of paper that split cleanly down the middle when he channeled chakra into it, cuts. That's the fundamental principle behind everything we're going to build from here. Fire burns. Water flows and adapts. Earth solidifies and endures. Lightning conducts and moves in straight, aggressive lines. Wind, He tore the paper cleanly in half to demonstrate cuts. Sharp, precise, and if refined properly, capable of slicing through nearly anything given sufficient control. Naruto took the offered slip of paper and channeled chakra into it with his usual enthusiasm, which is to say, considerably more force than the exercise actually called for. The paper didn't split cleanly. It shredded, violently, into more pieces than Naruto could easily count, several fragments scattering into the grass a good 10 feet away. Huh, Naruto said, staring down at the confetti-like remains scattered around his feet. Kakashi studied the wreckage with an expression that mixed genuine academic curiosity with barely restrained exasperation. That is, considerably more destructive than a typical wind affinity result. Most genin, when they first successfully manifest wind-natured chakra, produce a clean tear. Not, he gestured at the scattered confetti, whatever this is. Is that bad? Naruto asked, a little defensively. It's not bad, Kakashi said slowly, crouching down to pick up one of the shredded fragments, examining its torn edge with a critical eye. It's just further confirmation that your chakra isn't behaving like typical wind-natured chakra at all. There's an intensity to it, a rawness, that doesn't match standard affinity training, which tracks, honestly, given that you're not dealing with pure wind release. You're dealing with wind chakra that's fundamentally intertwined with something else. The storm thing, Naruto said. The storm thing, Kakashi confirmed. Which means, unfortunately, that the standard training progression probably isn't going to map cleanly onto whatever you're actually capable of. We're likely going to see, let's call it unpredictable overflow for a while, until we figure out how to properly scale your control down to something manageable before building it back up with precision. That prediction, as it turned out, was something of an understatement. Over the following days, Naruto's training sessions became an increasingly public spectacle. Not because anyone was watching intentionally, but because it became progressively harder to hide the aftermath. On the third day, attempting a basic wind blade exercise meant to simply extend a thin, controlled edge of chakra along the length of a kunai. Naruto instead produced a shockwave of pressurized air that uprooted a young sapling nearly 15 feet away and sent a flock of startled birds scattering from the nearby treeline in a panic that could be heard echoing across half the training ground. On the fifth day, a controlled breathing exercise meant to help Naruto regulate the flow of his chakra output, something Kakashi insisted was critical groundwork before attempting anything more advanced, ended with a sudden, unplanned burst of static discharge crackling audibly across Naruto's skin, strong enough that Kakashi had to physically intervene, grounding the excess charge through a hastily improvised technique before it could arc dangerously close to either of them. Ow, Naruto said afterward, shaking out his tingling fingers, hair standing on end in a way that would have been almost comical under different circumstances. That kinda hurt. That's because you're generating enough electrical discharge to genuinely injure yourself if it isn't properly grounded, Kakashi said, his usual lazy tone edged with real concern. This is exactly the kind of overflow I was worried about. Your control over the wind aspect is inconsistent enough on its own. Layering an electrical current on top of that inconsistency is a recipe for you accidentally hurting yourself far more than any opponent ever could. It was, in short, a difficult week. And difficult weeks, in a village as densely populated with shinobi, and shinobi gossip, as Konoha, rarely stay quiet for long. By the second week, word had begun circulating, in the particular hushed, speculative way that news travels through a shinobi village, that something unusual was happening out at the northeastern training grounds. Nothing concrete. Nothing official. Just fragments, a jonin here mentioning strange, localized weather disturbances near the treeline. A chunin there noting that Kakashi Hatake had been requesting unusually specific restricted training ground bookings. A pair of academy instructors idly speculating over lunch about the loud, occasionally alarming noises drifting from that direction most mornings. None of it, on its own, amounted to much. But taken together, it was more than enough to draw the attention of people whose entire job revolved around noticing exactly this kind of unusual pattern. If you've been watching this series for a while, you already know that Konoha isn't just a village full of well-meaning ninja doing their best. It's also a village with more than its fair share of political maneuvering, hidden agendas, and shadowy figures who consider information, especially information about power nobody else has access to be the most valuable currency in the world. And that's exactly the kind of attention this training was about to attract. It was during the third week of training, on a gray, overcast morning that carried just enough humidity in the air to make Naruto's still inconsistent chakra control that much more volatile, that everything finally came to a head. Kakashi had decided cautiously that it was time to attempt something slightly more advanced, a modified version of a standard wind-release exercise designed to help Naruto channel his chakra into a more contained, directional form rather than the wild, radiating bursts that had characterized most of his attempts so far. Focus on containment, Kakashi instructed, standing a careful distance away, arms crossed. Don't think about power. Think about shape. A narrow, controlled line, extending from your palm outward. Nothing more. Naruto nodded, closing his eyes briefly, genuinely trying, in a way that belied his usual reputation for reckless enthusiasm, to focus on the specific instruction. He'd been thinking, over the past several days, about what Kakashi had said regarding the clan history, about a bloodline hunted to near extinction because people feared what it could do in untrained, uncontrolled hands. He didn't want to be that. He didn't want to be something people were right to be afraid of. He extended his palms slowly, chakra gathering at his fingertips in a thin, contained thread of visible wind pressure. For a moment, a genuine, hopeful moment, it seemed to be working. The wind gathered cleanly, narrowly, exactly the shape Kakashi had described, and then, without warning, that same low, distant rumble of thunder that had accompanied Naruto's first activation on the bridge rolled through the clearing despite the complete absence of storm clouds overhead, and the contained thread of wind chakra at his fingertips detonated outward in an uncontrolled burst of crackling, static-charged pressure. The resulting shockwave tore through the clearing with considerably more force than anything Naruto had produced so far, uprooting 2 of the older practice posts entirely, splintering a nearby tree trunk clean through, and sending a visible pulse of displaced air rippling outward with enough force that Kakashi, even from his cautious distance, was forced to brace himself against the sudden gust. When the dust and displaced leaves finally settled, Naruto stood in the center of the clearing, breathing hard, staring at the devastation around him with wide, alarmed eyes. "Okay," he said shakily. That was way more than I meant to do." Kakashi, lowering his raised arm slowly, surveyed the damage with an expression that mixed genuine concern with something almost like grim vindication. "Yes," he said. "It certainly was. Unfortunately, a shockwave of that magnitude, in a village as densely populated with observant shinobi as Konoha, does not go unnoticed, regardless of how isolated the training ground had been chosen to be." Within the hour, a pair of ANBU had arrived to investigate the disturbance, drawn by the unmistakable telltale signs of a significant chakra discharge visible even from a considerable distance. Kakashi, with practiced ease, managed to smooth over the situation with a carefully worded explanation about advanced training exercises authorized directly by the Hokage, technically true, if considerably vaguer than the full reality, and the ANBU, after a brief, professionally skeptical exchange, departed without further incident. But not before one of them, Kakashi noted with quiet unease, lingered just a fraction of a second longer than professional courtesy required, gaze flicking toward Naruto with an expression that was difficult to read behind the smooth ceramic of an ANBU mask. That evening, in a considerably more formal meeting than either of them had anticipated needing so soon, Kakashi found himself standing once again before the Hokage's desk, though this time, the conversation carried a noticeably different tenor. "The council has begun asking questions," Hiruzen said without preamble, setting down a report Kakashi recognized, with a sinking feeling, as an official incident summary regarding the destroyed training ground equipment. "Not directly about the bloodline itself. That information remains, as far as I am aware, still contained to the 3 of us and Naruto. But about the unusual pattern of destructive training incidents attributed to your team over the past several weeks. Property damage of this magnitude, from a genin still weeks away from any Chunin evaluation, tends to draw exactly the kind of scrutiny we were hoping to avoid." "I've been as careful as I can be," Kakashi said, a rare note of genuine frustration slipping into his usually unbothered tone. "But Naruto's control simply isn't there yet, Hokage-sama. Every session produces some degree of unpredictable overflow. I can manage the immediate danger, but I cannot entirely prevent the visible aftermath, not without halting training altogether, which I don't believe serves anyone's interests, least of all Naruto's. Hiruzen rubbed at his temples, looking, for a moment, genuinely weary in a way that went beyond his usual burden of administrative duties. I am not suggesting you halt training, Kakashi. I understand the necessity of continuing, difficult as it may be to manage discreetly. But I need you to understand that we are no longer operating with the luxury of complete secrecy. Questions are being asked. And questions, in this village, have a way of eventually finding answers, whether we intend them to or not. If you're wondering exactly how much danger a piece of information like this represents once it starts leaking, even in small, seemingly harmless fragments, you're asking exactly the right question, because the answer is about to become a lot more concrete. Because it wasn't just the Council's administrative curiosity that had been drawn by the disturbance out at that training ground. Someone else had been watching, too, someone whose entire operating philosophy revolved around collecting exactly this kind of valuable, dangerous information before anyone else even realized it was worth collecting. Shino Aburame, no relation, in this instance, to the training incident itself, but rather an unrelated genin cutting through the northeastern training grounds on his way home from an entirely different exercise, would later report to his father, in the idle, unremarkable way children sometimes mention strange things they've noticed, that he'd seen a masked figure crouched in a tree near the damaged training ground, watching Naruto's session with an unusual, focused stillness before melting away into the forest the moment Kakashi's attention shifted. Shibi Aburame, recognizing the description for exactly what it implied, made a quiet, discreet report to the Hokage's office that same evening, a report that landed on Hiruzen Sarutobi's desk at almost exactly the same moment Kakashi was leaving his own troubled meeting about council scrutiny. Root operatives did not typically make mistakes of visibility. If one had been spotted, even briefly, even by an unrelated child cutting through the forest, it meant one of two things: either carelessness on the part of an otherwise disciplined organization, which seemed unlikely given Root's well-earned reputation for near-invisible surveillance, or a deliberate choice to be seen, a subtle message meant to communicate that their attention had already been drawn, and would not easily be redirected. Hiruzen suspected, with the particular weary certainty of a man who had spent decades navigating the political undercurrents of his own village, that it was very likely the latter. Danzo Shimura had built an entire career, an entire shadow organization, around the careful acquisition and control of exactly this kind of asset, powerful, unique, and dangerous enough that others feared it, valuable enough that he coveted it. A dormant bloodline resurfacing after generations of presumed extinction, manifesting inside the village's own Jinchuriki, was precisely the sort of development Danzo would consider far too valuable to simply leave in the hands of conventional training and conventional oversight. Hiruzen closed his eyes briefly, feeling the familiar, exhausting weight of an old rivalry reasserting itself in a new, more dangerous form. Back at the training ground the following morning, blissfully unaware of the political currents already beginning to swirl around him, Naruto continued grinding through the difficult, frustrating work of trying to bring some semblance of control to a power that seemed determined to do whatever it wanted regardless of his intentions. "This is so annoying," he complained, flopping backward onto the grass after yet another attempt ended in an uncontrolled, if considerably smaller, burst of wind that knocked over a stack of practice logs Kakashi had set up nearby. "Why won't it just listen to me?" Kakashi, settling down onto a nearby stump with the patient air of a teacher who had long since stopped expecting quick results from difficult training, considered the question seriously rather than dismissing it as simple childish frustration. "Because you're not just working with chakra-shape manipulation," he said. "You're working with two fundamentally different natures trying to occupy the same space at once. Wind, which wants to disperse and cut outward, and whatever electrical component drives the storm aspect, which wants to arc and discharge in the path of least resistance. Most shinobi spend years mastering a single chakra nature. You're effectively trying to master two simultaneously, with no established training methodology to draw from, because as far as either of us can tell, nobody alive has successfully done this in generations." "Great," Naruto said flatly, staring up at the gray, cloud-heavy sky. "So basically I'm just gonna keep blowing stuff up until I magically figure it out." "Not magically," Kakashi corrected. Deliberately. Through repetition, adjustment, and this part is going to be difficult for you specifically, I suspect, patience. He paused. Though I'll admit, we may benefit from bringing in additional expertise. My own knowledge of pure wind release, while solid, doesn't extend to whatever specific principles govern storm release. If there's anyone remaining who might have studied that Bloodline's techniques even secondhand, their guidance could accelerate this process considerably. Naruto sat up slightly at that, a flicker of interest breaking through his frustration. You think there's someone like that? Somebody who actually knows how this stuff is supposed to work? I don't know yet, Kakashi admitted. But the Hokage mentioned he intended to reach out through discreet channels to learn more about the Bloodline's history. If anyone can be found, even a distant historical scholar, or an aging survivor's descendant with fragmentary knowledge, it would be worth pursuing. That same afternoon, back at the academy training grounds where the rest of the newly minted genin continued their own individual training regimens, Sasuke Uchiha stood alone at a practice post, methodically working through a series of shuriken throws with the kind of focused, isolated intensity that had become increasingly familiar to anyone who knew him. He'd said little, publicly, about what had happened on that bridge, about the wind and static that had shattered Haku's ice mirrors and saved him while he lay incapacitated. But privately, the memory gnawed at him in a way he found difficult to shake. Sasuke Uchiha had spent his entire life since the massacre of his clan chasing a singular, all-consuming goal: to grow strong enough to face his brother, to avenge what had been taken from him, to prove that the Uchiha bloodline, his bloodline, the Sharingan itself, represented a power capable of overcoming any obstacle placed in its path. And now, suddenly, unexpectedly, the least likely person imaginable, the class dead last, the loudmouth orphan everyone had spent years dismissing as talentless, had manifested a bloodline of his own, one that, by all accounts, had shattered a defensive technique Sasuke's own activated Sharingan had failed to fully counter. It wasn't jealousy, exactly. Or at least, that's what Sasuke told himself, throwing another shuriken with slightly more force than the exercise strictly required, the projectile burying itself deep into the wooden post with a solid, satisfying thunk. It was simply recalibration, a reminder that the path to strength wasn't as linear, as guaranteed, as he perhaps allowed himself to believe. If Naruto, talentless, foolish, endlessly loud Naruto, could suddenly possess something this significant, entirely by accident, entirely without seeking it out, then what did that say about effort, about training, about the years Sasuke himself had poured into honing his own inherited power? He didn't have an answer yet. But the question settled into him with quiet, simmering discomfort, and he found himself, over the following days, watching Naruto's increasingly damaged training sessions with a scrutiny that had very little to do with simple curiosity. By the fourth week, Naruto's control had improved, marginally. He'd managed, through what felt like an endless, exhausting sequence of failed attempts, to at least begin narrowing the gap between controlled wind exercise and small-scale localized disaster. His wind blade technique, while still prone to occasional unpredictable overflow, had become reliable enough that Kakashi permitted him, cautiously, to begin practicing against stationary targets rather than empty air. The static, electrical component remained far more difficult to manage. It surfaced unpredictably, usually triggered by moments of frustration or exertion rather than deliberate intention, crackling faintly across Naruto's skin in a way that had become almost a familiar, if uncomfortable, sensation. We're going to need actual specialized guidance if we want to move past this plateau, Kakashi admitted one evening, watching Naruto nurse a mild static burn across his knuckles, an injury from an overflow that had arced back against himself rather than outward. I can help you build discipline, patience, chakra control fundamentals. But the storm aspect specifically requires knowledge neither of us actually possesses. So what do we do? Naruto asked, wincing slightly as he flexed his fingers. We wait, Kakashi said, for the Hokage to find us someone who actually knows what they're talking about. That night, unbeknownst to either of them, Hiruzen Sarutobi sat in his office long after the village had settled into darkness, a small, carefully worded letter spread across his desk, addressed to a name he hadn't spoken aloud in a very long time, a name belonging to one of the very few individuals still alive who might possess genuine, first-hand knowledge of the Storm Coast clan's techniques, someone who had, decades earlier, briefly crossed paths with a survivor of that near-total extermination and had spent years afterward quietly, privately, documenting whatever fragments of history they'd managed to learn before that survivor's own passing. Locating this individual, reaching out discreetly enough to avoid drawing further unwanted attention, and convincing them to travel to Konoha to assist with training a bloodline that history itself had tried so hard to erase. All of this would take time, careful diplomacy, and no small amount of risk. But Hiruzen suspected, given everything else currently converging around this situation, the Council's mounting scrutiny, the unmistakable shadow of Root's interest already creeping at the edges of this development, and whatever unsettling revelations still waited, half-processed, from Kushina's sealed scroll, that time was rapidly becoming the one resource they could least afford to waste. A month had passed since the mission to Wave Country, and in that time, Naruto's training had settled into an uneasy, grinding rhythm, incremental progress bought at the cost of scorched grass, splintered practice posts, and more than a few static burns across his own knuckles. He could, by this point, reliably produce a contained wind blade technique without it detonating outward into unplanned property damage. The electrical component remained stubbornly unpredictable, prone to surfacing whenever his concentration slipped or his frustration spiked, but even that had grown marginally less catastrophic than it had been in those first chaotic weeks. It wasn't mastery. Not even close. But it was progress, and Kakashi, while still cautious, still careful to keep training sessions isolated and discreet, had begun to allow himself something close to cautious optimism. That optimism took an abrupt backseat the morning Irika Yumino announced, in front of the entire assembled class of newly minted genin, that Team 7, along with every other qualifying team, had been nominated for the upcoming Chunin exams. The Chunin exams, Irika explained, standing at the front of a classroom that had gone electric with nervous excitement, represent an opportunity, and a considerable risk, for genin looking to advance in rank. Nomination isn't mandatory. If your team doesn't feel ready, you're free to withdraw without penalty. But if you do participate, understand that these exams are conducted jointly between multiple villages, and they are not without genuine danger. Naruto, predictably, had been practically vibrating out of his seat at the announcement, already imagining himself standing triumphant at the end of some grand tournament. Sasuke had said nothing, though the sharp, focused intensity in his dark eyes suggested he'd already made his decision the moment the word exam left Irika's mouth. Sakura, caught between her teammates' opposing energies, had simply looked nervously back and forth between them before nodding along with quiet determination of her own. Kakashi, upon hearing the news later that same day, had gone uncharacteristically still for a long moment before offering his own nomination without hesitation. "You're ready enough," he told Naruto privately, after their usual training session had wrapped for the day. "Not perfect. Not fully in control, but the exams themselves will test more than raw technique. They'll test judgment, adaptability, restraint. Frankly, those are things you need practice with regardless of the bloodline." "So I'm doing it?" Naruto asked, though it wasn't really a question. "You're doing it," Kakashi confirmed. But Naruto, his tone sharpened slightly, gaze locking onto the boys with unusual seriousness. "I need you to understand something important before we go any further. These exams draw shinobi and observers from every major hidden village. Kumogakure, Sunagakure, even a contingent from Otogakure, a newer, smaller village nobody knows much about yet. If your bloodline surfaces in front of that many outside observers, we lose any hope of controlling how that information spreads. This isn't like a discrete training ground on the edge of the village anymore. This is a stage, with an audience specifically trained to notice and evaluate exactly the kind of unusual technique you're carrying." Naruto swallowed, the weight of that settling over him. "So I just don't use it? At all?" "If you can avoid it," Kakashi said, "yes. Rely on your other skills, your shadow clones, your raw chakra reserves, your improvisational instincts. Save the bloodline as an absolute last resort, only if your life or a teammate's life genuinely depends on it. Can you do that?" Naruto hesitated, thinking back to that moment on the bridge, the desperate, instinctive surge that had erupted the instant he'd seen Sasuke in danger, entirely outside his conscious control. He wasn't entirely sure, if he was being honest with himself, that he could guarantee restraint under that kind of pressure. but he nodded anyway, because it was the only answer that felt right to give. "I'll try my best," he said. "I promise. If you already know your Naruto lore, you know exactly what's coming next. The Forest of Death, easily one of the most brutal proving grounds in the entire series, where dozens of genin teams are thrown into a sprawling, monster-infested forest and told to fight, scheme, and survive their way to a pair of matching scrolls. Under normal circumstances, that's already a nightmare scenario for a 12-year-old. Now add a barely controlled bloodline sitting like a loaded weapon just beneath the surface, and you've got a recipe for exactly the kind of chaos this story has been building toward. Let's get into it. The written portion of the first exam passed with the kind of tension you'd expect. Ibiki Marino's intimidating presence looming over a room full of nervous genin. An elaborate psychological test disguised as an impossible written exam, and Naruto's characteristically loud, if ultimately harmless, declaration of refusal to give up that had, against all odds, helped carry his team through to the second stage. The second stage, the infamous Forest of Death, began the following morning beneath a canopy of towering, ancient trees that blotted out most of the pale morning sunlight, leaving the forest floor steeped in a permanent, oppressive dimness. Anko Mitarashi, the exam's proctor for this stage, delivered her usual colorful warning about the forest's numerous lethal inhabitants, with evident relish, before setting the assembled genin teams loose to acquire a matching pair of heaven and earth scrolls and make their way to the central tower within the following 5 days. Team 7, Naruto, Sasuke, and Sakura, plunged into the dense undergrowth alongside dozens of other competing teams, already holding an earth scroll and desperately in need of its heaven counterpart. For the first day and a half, things proceeded with relative, if tense, normalcy. A brief skirmish with a rival team ended in a hasty retreat rather than open conflict. A close encounter with one of the forest's considerably oversized wildlife, an enormous constricting snake that very nearly made a meal of Sasuke before quick teamwork drove it off, left nerves frayed but injuries minimal. It was on the second day that everything went sideways. They'd stopped to rest near a small, muddy clearing, taking turns keeping watch while the others attempted to catch what little sleep the forest's oppressive atmosphere allowed. It was Sakura's watch when the first genjutsu settled over the clearing, subtle, insidious, designed to lull its targets into a false sense of continued safety, while an unseen enemy team closed in from multiple directions. By the time Sakura recognized the telltale wrongness of her own perception, the too-still birdsong, the way shadows seemed to stretch at slightly incorrect angles, it was already almost too late. A trio of aimed genin, having tracked their scent for the better part of an hour, emerged from the surrounding undergrowth with sharp, coordinated precision, clearly intending to eliminate the competition and claim Team 7's scrolls for themselves. Sasuke reacted first, Sharingan flaring to life as he broke the genjutsu's hold through sheer force of perception, throwing himself bodily between the attacking team and Sakura's still disoriented form. Naruto, jolted awake by the sudden commotion, found himself immediately surrounded, one aimed genin looming directly over him, Senbon-laced umbrella already descending in a strike clearly meant to incapacitate before he could fully orient himself to the danger. There wasn't time to think. There wasn't time to remember Kakashi's careful instructions about restraint, about relying on other skills, about saving the bloodline as an absolute last resort. There was only the instinctive, bone-deep certainty that he was about to be seriously hurt, and the same crackling, desperate surge that had erupted on that bridge in Wave Country flared to life once more. The umbrella's descending strike met a sudden, violent pulse of wind and static discharge that tore the weapon clean out of the attacking genin's grip, sending it spinning end over end into the surrounding trees with enough force to bury itself half a foot deep into solid bark. The aimed genin staggered backward, staring at his own empty, faintly singed hands with visible shock. Naruto, breathing hard, static still crackling faintly along his forearms, straightened up slowly, adrenaline and something that felt uncomfortably close to shame warring inside his chest. He'd promised he'd try to hold back. And he had, right up until the exact moment it actually mattered. The skirmish ended quickly after that, the disoriented AIM team retreating rather than risk further confrontation against an unknown, visibly dangerous technique. Team 7, shaken but intact, regrouped a short distance away, the immediate danger past but the incident's implications settling heavily over all three of them. Naruto, Sasuke said slowly, Sharingan still active, dark eyes fixed with unusual intensity on his teammate. What was that? It wasn't quite a question. More an accusation dressed up as one. I didn't mean to, Naruto said, the words tumbling out defensively. He was about to hit me, and it just happened, okay. Like on the bridge. You've been hiding this, Sasuke pressed, something sharp and unreadable simmering beneath his usually controlled exterior. This whole month. Training with Kakashi, disappearing every morning, this is what you've been doing. And nobody told me? It's complicated, Naruto said, wincing slightly at how inadequate that explanation sounded even to his own ears. The Hokage said it needs to stay quiet. It's dangerous, Sasuke. Not just for me. For other reasons too. Sasuke's jaw tightened, and for a moment, the old, familiar current of rivalry and resentment that had always simmered quietly beneath their friendship threatened to boil over into something considerably uglier. Guys, Sakura interjected, sharp and urgent, cutting through the rising tension with the kind of practical clarity that had, admittedly, been in shorter supply during her earlier months on the team. We can have this conversation literally any time that isn't right now, in the middle of a forest full of people who just watched Naruto's chakra do something none of us can explain. Can we please focus on not dying first? It was, unfortunately, excellent advice, and it arrived just in time, because the sound of rustling underbrush signaled that their earlier attackers, having regrouped at a safe distance, had apparently decided that discretion was, in fact, the better part of valor, and were making a hasty, undisguised retreat deeper into the forest rather than risk a second encounter with whatever Naruto had just displayed. Sasuke watched them go, something conflicted and unresolved still simmering behind his activated Sharingan, before finally, reluctantly, letting the technique fade and turning back toward his teammates. Fine, he said tightly. Later. But we are having this conversation later. Word of the incident, unfortunately, did not stay entirely contained to the 3 genin who'd witnessed it firsthand. The AIM genin team, having retreated in considerable disarray, made no particular effort to keep quiet about what had happened, partly out of genuine shock, and partly, perhaps, hoping that spreading word of an unknown, dangerous technique circulating in the forest might discourage other teams from pursuing them further. By the time Team 7 finally made their way to the central tower, having secured their matching scrolls through a combination of luck, teamwork, and no further bloodline incidents, whispers about some kind of lightning wind technique circulating among the Konoha genin had already begun quietly filtering through to some of the visiting delegations observing the exam's progress. Most of these whispers were vague, second-hand, easily dismissed as exaggeration born from the forest's already tense, adrenaline-soaked atmosphere. Most, not all, among the various foreign delegations observing the Chunin exams that year was a small contingent from Kumogakure, the Hidden Cloud Village, a village renowned throughout the elemental nations for its own considerable mastery of lightning release, and less publicly, for a long institutional memory regarding rare and dangerous bloodlines. Seated among this delegation was a Kumo Jonin named Hachiro, a quiet, watchful man in his late 30s who had spent the better part of his career studying historical accounts of unusual Kekkai Genkai for potential strategic value to his village. When the first vague whispers about a Konoha genin displaying wind chakra laced with lightning reached his ears through the exam's usual, ever-present rumor mill, he felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the tower's chilly stone corridors. Storm release, he murmured to himself, quiet enough that none of his fellow delegates overheard, memory dredging up fragments of old, half-forgotten briefings from decades past, historical records his own village had maintained, in far greater detail than Konoha's own scattered archives, regarding a small coastal clan wiped out generations ago in a conflict that, if certain long-suppressed accounts were to be believed, hadn't been quite so unanimous a decision among the involved villages as official history preferred to remember. Kumogakure, unlike some of its rivals, had maintained unusually thorough records regarding extinct or dormant bloodlines, a natural consequence of a village built, in no small part, around the careful cultivation and protection of its own rare Kekkai Genkai. And buried within those records, Hachiro recalled with mounting unease, was a detail rarely spoken of openly, that the coastal clan's extermination centuries ago had not been a unanimous, righteous suppression of dangerous power, as the sanitized version of history generally implied, but rather a coordinated land and resource grab dressed up in convenient, retroactive justification, one in which, if certain older records were accurate, an ancestor of Kumogakure's own founding lineage had played a considerably more direct role than the village's official history ever acknowledged. If that bloodline truly had resurfaced, inside Konoha's own Jinchuriki, of all people, the implications reached far beyond simple curiosity. Hachiro made a quiet, careful decision to observe the remainder of the exam with considerably sharpened attention. If you're watching this and wondering why a rumor about a wind lightning technique would send a Kumo shinobi into quiet, private alarm, this is exactly the moment where the deeper history of this bloodline starts paying off. Remember what Hiruzen told us back in Chapter 2, that clan wasn't destroyed by some righteous, unanimous act of collective self-defense against an overwhelming threat. It was destroyed because other clans, other villages, wanted what they had and feared what they represented. And now, generations later, one of the parties who may have had a hand in that original extermination is sitting in the audience of Naruto's Chunin exam, and they've just heard a rumor that should not be possible. Trust me, this detail is going to matter a lot more before this story's done. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss exactly how. The preliminary rounds, a hastily arranged series of one-on-one matches meant to thin down the unexpectedly large pool of genin who'd successfully completed the forest stage, began not long after Team 7's arrival at the tower, much to the visible dismay of several exhausted competitors who'd been hoping for a longer recovery period. Naruto's own preliminary match, drawn against a competent but unremarkable genin from a lesser-known village, proceeded largely without incident, a hard-fought, physically demanding bout that Naruto ultimately won through sheer stubborn endurance, and a well-timed shadow clone ambush, without any need to call upon the bloodline simmering beneath the surface. It was, in short, exactly the kind of restrained, controlled performance Kakashi had hoped for. But restraint, as it turned out, only had to fail once to draw exactly the kind of attention everyone had been working so hard to avoid, and the forest incident, however contained the immediate aftermath had seemed, had already planted a seed of dangerous curiosity that was not going to simply fade away on its own. Following the conclusion of the preliminary matches, as the surviving genin were dismissed to prepare for the month-long training period before the final tournament stage, Hachiro made a quiet, deliberate point of positioning himself near enough to catch a clear glimpse of Naruto Uzumaki as the boy exited the arena, cataloging his appearance, his chakra signature, his general bearing, with the careful, methodical attention of a man building a mental file he fully intended to expand upon once he returned home. Interesting, he murmured to a fellow Kumo shinobi standing beside him, voice pitched low enough to avoid drawing unwanted attention. That's the one they were talking about in the forest. His companion, a younger Kumo genin serving as part of the delegation's junior observation team, glanced over with mild curiosity. The blonde kid? Doesn't look like much. Perhaps not, Hachiro said, something distant and calculating settling behind his eyes. But if even half of what I've heard about that clan's old techniques holds true, appearances have never mattered nearly as much as what's buried underneath them. He paused, gaze lingering thoughtfully on Naruto's retreating back. The bloodline was supposed to be wiped out generations ago. Every record we maintained confirmed as much. If that boy is genuinely carrying it, he trailed off, shaking his head slowly, that changes things considerably. Things our village will want to know about. Sooner rather than later. Word of this exchange, fortunately, did not reach Naruto or Team 7 directly. Foreign delegations rarely broadcast their private strategic calculations to the genin they were quietly assessing. But it did reach the ears of a considerably more attentive party, whose entire operational purpose revolved around noticing exactly this kind of dangerous, valuable conversation happening in the margins of official events. A root operative, embedded discreetly among the tower's support staff under an unremarkable cover identity, had been specifically tasked, following the earlier training ground incident, with monitoring any unusual foreign interest directed toward Naruto Uzumaki throughout the exam's duration. Hachiro's quiet, careful observation, however subtly conducted, had not escaped that watchful attention. By that same evening, a brief, coded report had made its way back through Root's careful internal channels, eventually landing on a desk belonging to a man whose entire philosophy of village strength revolved around the careful, ruthless acquisition of exactly the kind of asset currently drawing outside attention. Danzo Shimura read the report twice, expression giving away nothing of the calculations already turning behind his single visible eye. A dormant bloodline, believed extinct for generations, resurfacing inside the village's Jinchuriki, foreign interest already forming, from a village with its own considerable history regarding rare Kekii Genkai. And Hiruzen, predictably, choosing caution and secrecy over decisive, controlled action. It was, Danzo reflected, precisely the kind of situation his old rival's soft-hearted sentimentality was ill-equipped to properly manage. A power this rare, this potentially devastating, could not simply be left to develop haphazardly under the guidance of a single Jonin's improvised training regimen, subject to the whims of a 12-year-old still forming judgment, and an outside world already beginning to circle with dangerous interest. If Hiruzen would not act with appropriate decisiveness, Danzo would need to begin, quietly and carefully, considering what alternative measures might eventually prove necessary, for the good of the village, if nothing else. He set the report aside, reaching instead for a blank sheet of paper, and began, in his own careful, deliberate hand, drafting the first of what would become several increasingly pointed inquiries directed toward the Hokage's office regarding the full extent of what, precisely, Naruto Uzumaki's training program actually entailed. Back at the tower, blissfully unaware of the quiet political machinery already beginning to turn against him from multiple directions at once, Naruto spent that evening nursing a handful of minor bruises from his preliminary match, sharing a quiet meal with Sakura in one of the tower's modest common rooms, grilled fish and rice, simple fare provided for the exhausted genin still recovering from the forest stage's ordeal, while Sasuke remained conspicuously absent, having retreated instead to a private corner to continue the intense, isolated training regimen that had become increasingly characteristic of him since the incident on the bridge. He's still upset, Sakura said quietly, following Naruto's gaze towards Sasuke's distant, focused form. About the bloodline thing. About not being told. I know, Naruto admitted, poking at his rice without much enthusiasm. I don't blame him, honestly. If it was the other way around, I'd probably be mad too. He sighed. I just don't know how to explain it without making it worse. Like, hey, sorry I didn't mention the ancient, extinct bloodline I apparently have now. The Hokage just said it's a huge secret that could get me killed if the wrong people find out isn't exactly a normal conversation to have. Sakura winced sympathetically. Yeah, that's a lot to unpack over dinner. Tell me about it, Naruto muttered. They sat in companionable silence for a while longer, the quiet murmur of other recovering genin filling the space around them, before Sakura spoke again, her voice softer, more hesitant. Naruto, she said slowly. That thing you did in the forest. When those aimed genin attacked us. It looked like it hurt you. A little. Your hands were shaking. Naruto glanced down at his own hands, remembering the faint, lingering static burn that had crackled uncomfortably along his fingertips in the aftermath of that desperate defensive burst. Yeah, he admitted, it does that sometimes. Kakashi-sensei says it's because I don't have control over it yet. Like, the wind part is hard enough, but there's this whole other electricity part layered on top of it, and when I don't manage it right, it kind of zaps me too. Not just whoever I'm aiming it at. That sounds dangerous, Sakura said, frowning with genuine concern rather than simple curiosity. Like, dangerous for you specifically, not just as a weapon. Yeah, Naruto said quietly. It kind of is. He didn't elaborate further, and Sakura, sensing the weight settling behind his uncharacteristically subdued tone, didn't press. But the concern lingered in her expression long after their quiet meal concluded, a small, genuine worry for her teammates' well-being that had, somewhere over the preceding weeks, grown considerably beyond simple team loyalty. The following morning, before the surviving genin teams dispersed for their month of individual preliminary training ahead of the final tournament, Kakashi pulled Naruto aside for a private, urgent conversation, expression carrying a gravity that immediately put Naruto on edge. The Hokage received several concerning reports overnight, Kakashi said without preamble. Regarding foreign interest in your performance during the forest stage. And regarding continued, domestic scrutiny from parties who are becoming increasingly insistent about understanding the full scope of your training. Danzo, Naruto said, recognizing the careful, deliberate way Kakashi avoided naming names in public spaces. Among others, Kakashi confirmed grimly. The Hokage believes, given these developments, that it's time to accelerate your training considerably before the final tournament stage begins. Rather than continuing with generalized wind-natured exercises alone, he's arranged for additional, specialized guidance, someone with genuine, direct historical knowledge of the Storm Coast clan's actual techniques, rather than the two of us continuing to improvise based on incomplete theory. Naruto's eyes widened. Wait, seriously? You found someone who actually knows this stuff? The Hokage found someone, Kakashi corrected. An individual with a personal connection to the clan's surviving history, currently living in quiet retirement, who has agreed, cautiously, and under considerable secrecy, to travel to Konoha and provide direct mentorship during your remaining preparation time before the finals. His visible eye studied Naruto carefully. This is a significant opportunity, Naruto. But it also means the stakes surrounding this entire situation are rising considerably faster than any of us anticipated. Foreign interest, domestic political maneuvering. A specialized mentor whose very existence needs to remain carefully guarded. This is no longer simply about you learning to control an unusual technique. This is becoming something with real geopolitical weight behind it. Naruto swallowed, the enormity of that statement settling heavily over him. A month ago, he'd been just another struggling genin, barely scraping by on stubborn determination and an oversized reserve of chakra nobody quite understood the origin of. Now, apparently his own untrained, still developing bloodline was drawing the attention of foreign villages and shadowy internal factions alike. Okay, he said finally, steadying himself with visible effort. So when do I meet this mentor? Soon, Kakashi said. Very soon. The Hokage is finalizing arrangements as we speak. In the meantime, his tone sharpened slightly, carrying an edge of genuine urgency. I need you to be more careful than ever, Naruto. No unnecessary displays. No triggering the bloodline unless your life genuinely depends on it. The margin for error just got considerably smaller, and the people watching just got considerably more dangerous. The safe house Hiruzen had arranged sat well outside the usual bustle of central Konoha, a modest, unassuming building tucked into a quiet residential district favored by retired shinobi and civilian families alike, chosen specifically for how thoroughly ordinary it appeared from the outside. No unusual security. No obvious ANBU presence. Just weathered wooden siding, a small, overgrown garden, and the kind of unremarkable exterior that drew absolutely no attention from anyone passing by. Which was, of course, precisely the point. Naruto arrived a few minutes before the appointed time, Kakashi at his side, both of them dressed in civilian clothes rather than their usual shinobi attire. Another deliberate precaution, Kakashi had explained, meant to avoid drawing attention should anyone happen to notice a jonin and his student making an unusual visit to this particular neighborhood. Remember, Kakashi said quietly as they approached the front door, whatever you're about to hear in there, it stays contained to the three of us, the Hokage, and nobody else. Not Sakura. Not Sasuke. Not anyone. This individual is taking a considerable risk simply by agreeing to this meeting. Naruto nodded, swallowing down a mixture of nervous anticipation and genuine curiosity that had been building steadily since Kakashi first mentioned this arrangement. A real mentor. Someone who actually understood the bloodline crackling beneath his skin, rather than the two of them fumbling through improvised theory and hoping for the best. Kakashi knocked twice, paused, then knocked once more, some kind of prearranged signal, Naruto assumed, and after a moment, the door opened to reveal a figure that didn't match anything Naruto had been quietly imagining. He'd expected, somehow, someone imposing. Someone who looked the part of a legendary bloodline's last surviving connection, weathered, perhaps scarred, carrying themselves with the kind of gravity that matched the weight of the history they represented. Instead, standing in the doorway was a woman who appeared to be somewhere in her 60s, silver-gray hair pulled back into a simple, practical knot, dressed in plain, unassuming civilian clothing, long sleeves despite the mild weather, a modest, high-collared blouse, and simple trousers that gave away nothing about her background beyond a general impression of careful, deliberate practicality. Her eyes, though, when they settled on Naruto, carried an intensity that immediately dispelled any impression of ordinariness her outward appearance might have suggested. So, she said, voice carrying a quiet, measured calm that nonetheless held an unmistakable undercurrent of scrutiny, this is the boy. Naruto, Kakashi said, this is Chiome. She's agreed, at considerable personal risk, to assist with your training. Chiome, Naruto repeated, offering an awkward but genuine bow. Thank you? For agreeing to help, I mean. Something that might have been the ghost of a smile flickered briefly across the older woman's weathered features before settling back into careful neutrality. Come inside, she said. This isn't a conversation for doorsteps. The interior of the safe house was as unremarkable as its exterior, a small, simply furnished sitting room, a low table set with a modest pot of tea already steeping, and little else beyond the bare essentials one might expect from a temporary residence. Chiome gestured for them both to sit, pouring 3 cups of tea with the unhurried precision of someone long accustomed to using small, deliberate rituals to steady her own thoughts before difficult conversations. I imagine, she said, once they'd settled, that Hiruzen has already given you the broad strokes of the history. The clan. The bloodline. The manner of its near destruction. He told me some of it, Naruto confirmed. About the clan on the Storm Coast. About how they got wiped out because other clans were scared of what they could do, or wanted the bloodline for themselves. Chiome's expression, for just a moment, tightened with something that looked like old, carefully managed grief. That is the broad shape of it, yes, though the full truth carries considerably more detail, and considerably more blood, than any brief summary can properly convey. You knew someone, Naruto said carefully, remembering what Kakashi had told him about her connection to the clan's history. From the clan. Before they were gone. I did, Chiome said quietly. Her name was Suzumi. We were young together, decades ago, in circumstances I won't burden you with the full details of today. She was among the very last survivors of the Storm Coast clan's destruction, a young woman who managed to escape the coordinated raids that claimed nearly everyone else she'd ever known, and who spent the remainder of her life carrying that survival as both a blessing and an unbearable weight. She paused, gaze growing distant with old memory. She taught me what she could of her clan's history, and some fragments of their techniques, before she passed. Not because I carried the bloodline myself, I never did, but because she feared, rightly as it turns out, that if she didn't pass that knowledge to someone, it would disappear from the world entirely, along with everyone who'd ever carried it. So you know the actual techniques, Naruto said, leaning forward with undisguised eagerness. Not just the history. The real stuff. How to control it properly. Some of it, Chiome said, a note of caution entering her voice. Suzumi was young herself when her clan was destroyed, barely older than you are now, in fact. She hadn't yet mastered her own bloodline's full potential before she lost access to the teachers, the training, the accumulated generational knowledge that might have guided her further. What she taught me was fragmentary. Foundational, certainly, and valuable, but incomplete. You should understand that going into this, Naruto. I am not offering you the full, polished mastery of a clan elder who spent decades perfecting these techniques. I am offering you the surviving fragments of a young woman's incomplete education, preserved as faithfully as an outsider's memory allows. Naruto absorbed this for a moment, something in Chiome's careful honesty settling a weight of realistic expectation over his earlier excitement. That's still more than I've got now, he said finally, which is basically nothing except blowing stuff up by accident. Something that might have been genuine warmth flickered behind Chiome's careful reserve. Yes, she said. I imagine it is. Over the following hour, Chiome laid out, with the same careful, measured precision she'd shown throughout their conversation, the foundational principles Suzumi had once shared with her, principles that, as it turned out, reframed much of what Naruto and Kakashi had been struggling to piece together through weeks of improvised trial and error. The fundamental error in your current approach, Chiome explained, based on what Kakashi has described to me of your training so far, is treating the wind and storm aspects as a single, unified technique that simply happens to include an electrical byproduct. That is backward. The Storm Coast clan's techniques were built on the understanding that wind and electrical current are two distinct forces that must be individually mastered before they can be properly layered together. Attempting to force them into unity before either element is independently controlled is precisely why you keep experiencing what you describe as overflow. So I need to get good at wind by itself first, Naruto said slowly, working through the logic. And separately get good at the lightning part. Before I try putting them together? Precisely, Chiome confirmed. Your wind manipulation, from what Kakashi describes, has improved considerably through his instruction, though it remains cruder and more forceful than refined technique typically allows. The electrical component, meanwhile, appears to surface almost entirely as an uncontrolled byproduct of emotional intensity, rather than as a deliberately cultivated skill in its own right. Suzumi described this exact pattern in her own early training, before her teachers helped her develop proper isolation and control. How do I do that? Naruto asked. The isolation thing. Through a specific breathing and chakra cycling exercise, Chiome said, designed to draw the electrical component of your chakra to the surface deliberately, in small, controlled quantities, rather than allowing it to surface unpredictably under emotional duress. It will feel, initially, considerably less dramatic than what you experienced in genuine combat. That is by design, Suzumi's teachers believed, correctly, based on what limited historical accounts exist, that attempting to master this bloodline through dramatic, high-stakes practice invited exactly the kind of uncontrolled overflow you've been experiencing. True mastery begins small, quiet, and deliberate. She proceeded to demonstrate, with slow, careful precision, a specific hand seal sequence and breathing pattern, one Naruto recognized, distantly, as bearing some structural similarity to basic chakra control exercises he'd learned at the academy, though modified in ways that felt subtly, meaningfully different. Try it, she instructed. Slowly. Don't reach for the dramatic surge you're used to. Reach instead for something small. A whisper, rather than a shout. Naruto closed his eyes, working through the unfamiliar breathing pattern, focusing not on the wild, uncontrolled crackle he'd come to associate with the bloodline's activation, but instead on something smaller, quieter, an attempt to coax forward just the faintest thread of static, rather than the violent surge his instincts kept reaching for. For a long, tense moment, nothing happened. And then, faint and barely perceptible, a small thread of static crackled gently across his fingertips, contained, controlled. Nothing at all like the violent discharge that had shattered ice on that bridge in Wave Country or torn a weapon from an attacker's grip in the Forest of Death. Naruto's eyes flew open, staring down at his own faintly glowing fingertips in genuine astonishment. That's so much smaller than before, he said. But I actually feel like I'm the one controlling it. Instead of it just happening to me. Yes, Chiome said. And this time, the small smile that crossed her weathered features carried no reservation at all. That is precisely the point. If you've ever wondered what real, foundational bloodline training actually looks like, as opposed to the dramatic, instant mastery version so many stories like to skip straight to, this is it. Small. Quiet. Deliberately unglamorous. Because real control, the kind that actually holds up under pressure, doesn't come from chasing the biggest, flashiest version of a technique first. It comes from mastering the whisper before you ever try to shout. Keep that in mind, because it's going to matter a great deal by the time we reach the finals of this tournament. Over the following 2 weeks, Naruto's training took on an entirely new character. Where his sessions with Kakashi had focused on wind-natured fundamentals, chakra shape manipulation, cutting technique, directional control, his additional sessions with Chiome, conducted with the same careful discretion as their first meeting, focused almost entirely on the electrical components Suzumi had once described to her decades earlier. Progress, this time, came in small, incremental steps rather than the chaotic, destructive bursts that had characterized his earlier attempts. Naruto learned to draw forward small, contained threads of static discharge, first from his fingertips, then gradually expanding to a faint, controlled current running the length of his forearms. Always carefully monitored, always deliberately restrained rather than allowed to build toward the overwhelming surge his instincts still occasionally reached for under stress. You're doing well, Chiome told him, near the end of their second week together, watching Naruto complete the exercise with a steadiness that would have been unthinkable a month earlier. Better, in some respects, than Suzumi managed at a similar stage in her own training, though she had the benefit of proper clan teachers guiding her, which you unfortunately do not. Does that mean I'm ready to actually try putting the wind and lightning parts together? Naruto asked, unable to fully suppress his eagerness. Chiome considered this carefully, weighing something behind her measured expression. Cautiously, she said finally. In small, controlled increments, and only under close supervision. This is the stage where Suzumi's own training, tragically, was cut short by her clan's destruction, meaning we are moving, from this point forward, into territory even I can only guide you through theoretically, rather than through direct, tested experience. So we're kind of figuring this part out together, Naruto said. In a sense, Chiome agreed. Though I would remind you that figuring it out together with a technique capable of the destructive potential you've already demonstrated carries considerably more risk than most training regimens ordinarily involve. We will proceed carefully, deliberately, and you will listen closely to my instructions, rather than allowing your usual instincts toward bold experimentation to override caution. Naruto, to his credit, nodded with genuine solemnity, the weight of Chiome's warning settling clearly enough that even his usual impulsive confidence tempered itself accordingly. The first attempt at combining the two elements, conducted 3 days later under Chiome's watchful supervision at the same isolated training ground Naruto had used with Kakashi, began with painstaking slowness. A thin, controlled thread of wind chakra extended carefully from his palm, followed, only once that wind current had stabilized fully, by the careful, deliberate introduction of a similarly small, controlled thread of electrical discharge. For a long, suspended moment, the two elements existed side by side without merging, a faint current of cutting wind pressure running alongside a thin, crackling thread of static, close enough to nearly touch but not yet properly unified. Now, Chiome instructed quietly, draw them together. Slowly. Do not force it. Simply allow the two currents to find their own natural convergence. Naruto concentrated, sweat beating faintly at his temples with the effort of maintaining such careful, deliberate control over two simultaneously active chakra streams, and slowly, achingly slowly, guided the two threads toward one another. The moment they touched, something remarkable happened. Rather than the violent, uncontrolled detonation that had characterized every previous instance of the Bloodline's activation, the two currents merged with a low, resonant hum, wind and lightning weaving together into a single, contained thread that crackled with visible, blue-white energy, sharp enough at its edges to visibly slice through the air around it, yet held, remarkably, within Naruto's direct, conscious control. He stared at the small, spinning current hovering just above his open palm, barely larger than a coin, nothing at all like the wide, devastating shockwaves he'd produced under panic, and felt something shift inside his chest that went considerably beyond simple technical achievement. This was his. Genuinely, deliberately, controllably his, not an accident of desperate instinct, but something he had built, piece by piece, through patient, careful effort. That's it, he breathed, hardly daring to move for fear of disrupting the delicate balance he'd achieved. That's actually it. Yes, Chiome said, and the quiet pride in her voice was unmistakable now, all earlier reservation giving way to something that looked remarkably like the expression of a teacher watching a student finally grasp something long worked toward. That, Naruto, is the true foundation of storm release. Small. Controlled. Entirely your own. Naruto spent the following days refining this small, controlled technique, gradually expanding its size and duration under Chiome's careful guidance, learning to shape it into a functional cutting edge capable of slicing cleanly through solid wood without the accompanying static discharge arcing back dangerously against himself. It was, by any reasonable measure, a genuine breakthrough, the first properly controlled, deliberately mastered application of the bloodline he'd carried, unknowingly, his entire life. But breakthroughs, particularly ones involving a bloodline this rare and this coveted, rarely stay entirely private for long, and this one, unfortunately, was no exception. Far to the east, in a hidden laboratory complex nestled deep within territory that officially belonged to no recognized village, a pale, serpentine figure sat hunched over a collection of scattered reports and intelligence gathered from a network of spies and informants planted throughout the elemental nations. Orochimaru had, of course, already been planning his own elaborate scheme regarding the upcoming Chunin exam finals, an invasion, meticulously coordinated with Sunegakure's own grievances against Konoha, timed to strike during the chaos and confusion of the tournament itself. That plan remained, for the most part, unchanged by the intelligence currently spread before him. But intelligence regarding an extinct bloodline's unexpected resurfacing, inside Konoha's own Jinchuriki no less, was precisely the kind of development a man with Orochimaru's particular interests found difficult to simply ignore. Storm release, he murmured, running one pale finger thoughtfully along the edge of a report compiled from fragmentary observations gathered by a low-level spy embedded near the Chunin exams tower during the forest stage. How curious! Kabuto Yakushi, standing attentively nearby, tilted his head with the particular blend of clinical curiosity and quiet ambition that characterized most of his interactions with his master's research. You're familiar with the Bloodline, Orochimaru-sama? Familiar, Orochimaru said, a slow, considering smile spreading across his pale features, is perhaps too strong a word. I am aware of its historical existence, and its supposed extinction, from records I acquired some years ago during my own research into rare Kekii Genkai. I had assumed, as had most reasonable observers, that the Bloodline had genuinely died out generations past. His golden eyes glinted with unmistakable, predatory interest. It appears reasonable assumption was, once again, insufficiently curious. Should this change our plans for the invasion? Kabuto asked carefully. Not our overall strategy, Orochimaru said, setting the report aside with deliberate, unhurried care. But it does suggest a rather valuable opportunity worth keeping firmly in mind. A bloodline capable of the kind of destructive potential these reports describe, still in its early, undeveloped stages, unguarded by proper clan structure or generational training, he trailed off, tongue flicking briefly across his lips in a gesture that had, over the years, become an unmistakable tell for his more ambitious calculations. Such things have a way of proving useful, one way or another, regardless of how events ultimately unfold during the exam's finals. Kabuto said nothing further, though the careful, clinical attention with which he began cross-referencing the report against Orochimaru's own extensive research archives made his private calculations plain enough without need for further comment. Back in Konoha, blissfully unaware of the increasingly tangled web of outside interest now converging around him, Kumo's quiet historical alarm, Danzo's mounting political pressure, and now, unknowingly, Orochimaru's own predatory curiosity, Naruto continued his training with Chiome and Kakashi, both steadily building genuine, deliberate mastery over a technique that, only weeks earlier, had existed solely as uncontrolled, panicked instinct. You've made remarkable progress, Chiome told him, during what would prove to be one of their final sessions together before the finals. Considerably faster than I honestly anticipated, given the circumstances. Does that mean I'm ready? Naruto asked. For the finals, I mean. If I need to use it, Chiome considered the question with her usual careful deliberation. Ready to use a small, controlled application of the technique defensively, if genuine necessity demands it? Yes, I believe so. Ready to rely on it as your primary strategy, or to push toward the larger, more destructive applications your instincts still occasionally reach for under stress? No. Not yet. Possibly not for a considerable time yet. Her expression grew more serious. This bloodline claimed the lives of an entire clan who possessed, by all historical accounts, considerably more refined training and generational knowledge than you currently have access to. Respect what it's capable of, Naruto. Don't allow early success to convince you that mastery has arrived faster than it genuinely has. Naruto nodded slowly, the weight of her warning settling alongside the genuine pride he felt at his own hard-won progress. I'll be careful, he said. I promise. I don't want to end up like, he paused, glancing toward Chiome with sudden, careful hesitation. Like Suzumi did. However that ended up happening. Something old and sorrowful flickered behind Chiome's weathered eyes before settling back into careful composure. No, she said quietly. I don't imagine you do, which is precisely why patience, in this particular pursuit, will serve you considerably better than haste ever could. As the finals approached, Naruto found himself, for the first time in weeks, feeling something closer to genuine confidence rather than anxious uncertainty regarding the bloodlines simmering beneath his skin. He had a foundation now, small, controlled, deliberately built rather than accidentally triggered, and while Chiome's careful warnings about the dangers of overreach lingered in the back of his mind, they existed now alongside genuine, hard-won competence rather than simple fear of the unknown. He still hadn't fully reconciled things with Sasuke, whose simmering tension regarding the entire situation remained frustratingly unresolved beneath the surface of their continued teamwork. He still didn't know what, precisely, Kushina's sealed scroll contained, or why Hiruzen's expression had grown so visibly troubled in the weeks since first reviewing its contents. And he remained, as Kakashi's careful warnings continued to remind him, entirely unaware of just how much outside attention his still developing bloodline had already begun to attract from multiple, increasingly dangerous directions. But for now, standing in the quiet aftermath of his final training session with Chiome, watching a small, controlled thread of crackling wind and lightning dance obediently across his own outstretched palm, Naruto allowed himself, just for a moment, to feel something like genuine hope. Whatever waited for him in the tournament finals, whatever dangers still lurked, unseen, in the political shadows converging around him, he would face them, this time, carrying something that was genuinely, deliberately, controllably his own.